Two of the most famous warriors in history. Two of the most demanding codes ever written. In the blue corner, the samurai, a man who believed the only cure for a mistake was disembowelment. In the red corner, the knight, a man who believed the only cure for everything was charging in a straight line while shouting about God. For centuries, we have asked who would win in a fight. That is the wrong question. The real question is, who had the tougher employee handbook? Who made the harder life choices? Who turned a rigid idea into a religion? This is samurai versus knights, the battle of the extremes, Bushido versus chivalry. Who had the code that ultimately doomed them? Let's find out. Round 1. The economics of honor. Who was worse with money? Knights were expensive. A full suit of plate armor cost as much as a small farm. A war horse cost even more. To fund this, knights relied on a system of fiefs and loot. But their favorite way to make money wasn't farming, it was kidnapping.
In medieval Europe, war was a business. You didn't kill a wealthy opponent. You captured him and ransomed him back to his family. It was catch and release fishing for millionaires. When the French King John II was captured by the English at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, his ransom was 3 million gold crowns. The English economy essentially ran on kidnapping French people for a solid decade. It was organized crime with a coat of arms. The samurai, especially in the Edo period, were paid in rice, literally. Their salary was measured in koku, the amount of rice needed to feed one man for a year. As the economy modernized and merchants started using currency, the samurai were stuck with a fluctuating commodity. They weren't allowed to engage in trade because it was below them. So you had a class of elite warriors who were legally forbidden from working, paid in a currency that rotted, and forced to borrow money from the lower-class merchants just to buy tea.
By the 19th century, most samurai were deeply in debt to the very people they were supposed to be better than. They were the world's first house-poor aristocracy. To make matters worse, the shogunate enforced sankin kotai, or alternate attendance. This law required daimyo lords to spend every other year in the capital, Edo. They had to maintain 2 massive households, one in their home province and one in Edo, and travel between them with a huge, expensive entourage. It was a brilliant political move to keep them broke and unable to rebel. Imagine if the government forced every billionaire to buy a new private jet every year just to keep them from getting too powerful. The knights' economy was corrupt, but it worked. The samurai's economy was designed by their own government to keep them powerless. Knights were greedy gangsters. Samurai were economically illiterate prisoners of a system built to drain them. Samurai take this round.
Being a gangster pays better than being paid in grain.
Round 2. Technology denial. Who hated progress more? Knights hated the crossbow. In 1139, the Pope actually banned the use of crossbows against Christians because they were hateful to God. Why? Not because they were cruel, but because a peasant with 2 weeks of training could kill a knight who had trained for 20 years. It disrupted the social order. It made war unfair. But eventually, they adapted. By the 15th century, knights were using plate armor specifically designed to deflect arrows and bolts. They innovated. They complained, and then they evolved. Samurai initially loved guns. When the Portuguese introduced the arquebus in 1543, the Japanese mass-produced them. In the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, Oda Nobunaga deployed a massive force of peasant gunners, some sources say 3,000, to obliterate the Takeda clan's traditional cavalry charge.
Rows of Ashigaru foot soldiers fired from behind wooden palisades and cut down wave after wave of mounted samurai. It was the Agincourt of Japan. But then, something strange happened. Once Japan was unified under the Tokugawa shogunate, they essentially put the gun back in the box. For 250 years, the sword, the katana, remained the symbol of power. They chose aesthetics over efficiency. They deliberately stagnated military technology to preserve the social hierarchy where the swordsman was king. When Commodore Perry's black ships arrived in Edo Bay in 1853 with modern cannons and steam-powered warships, the samurai realized they had spent 2 centuries polishing swords while the rest of the world was building industrial murder machines. Knights whined about the crossbow, then built armor to stop it. Samurai mastered the gun, then locked it in a cabinet for 250 years. One code, adapted to survive.
The other chose tradition over reality, and reality showed up in 1853 with cannons. Samurai take this round. Round 3, loyalty. Who lied about it more? Chivalry demanded that a knight serve his lord, defend the church, and protect the weak. In practice, chivalry had a massive asterisk. It only applied to other nobles. If you were a peasant, chivalry did not protect you. It did not even see you. When the Knights of the First Crusade stormed Jerusalem in 1099, they slaughtered thousands. Muslim and Jewish civilians were massacred in the streets and inside mosques. The chronicler Raymond of Aguilera described blood running ankle-deep in the Temple of Solomon. These were men who had marched across a continent under the banner of Christ, wearing crosses on their chests, singing hymns. And when they arrived at the holiest city in their faith, they turned it into a slaughterhouse. The code said protect the weak, the sword said otherwise.
But at least the knights were honest about what they were. They broke chivalry in the open, in broad daylight, and nobody pretended it was anything else. Bushido demanded absolute loyalty to one's lord. Die for him, kill for him, follow him into death if necessary. But in practice, samurai switched allegiances constantly, especially during the Sengoku period, roughly 1467 to 1615. Betrayal was so common that historians have described it as a defining feature of the era. The most famous example is Akechi Mitsuhide, a trusted general of Oda Nobunaga. In 1582, Mitsuhide marched 13,000 troops to the Honnoji Temple in Kyoto. He surrounded the temple and set it ablaze. Nobunaga, trapped inside with only a handful of guards, was forced to commit seppuku as the walls burned around him. His most loyal general had become his executioner. The Sengoku period was not a story of loyal samurai dying for their masters.
It was a story of samurai calculating which master was most likely to win and adjusting their loyalty accordingly. Knights broke their code in the open. Samurai broke theirs while pretending it was sacred. One was a thug in armor. The other was a thug in a poem. Samurai take this round. Round 4, treatment of women. Pedestal versus halberd. Chivalry put noblewomen on a pedestal. They were objects to be admired, protected, and fought for. But they were also essentially prisoners. A noblewoman in medieval Europe had very little legal power. She was a bargaining chip in marriage alliances. The courtly love tradition required a knight to devote himself to a lady, usually someone else's wife, and express his devotion through poetry, gifts, and emotional suffering. It was a fantasy precisely because real life was so rigid. Women were symbols, not participants. Samurai women of the warrior class had a different role. While still part of a patriarchal society, they were trained to use the naginata, a polearm, to defend their homes. In a siege, they were expected to fight to the death. There are accounts of women like Tomoe Gozen, who served as a field commander in the Genpei War in the late 12th century. She was described as riding into battle, taking heads, and fighting with a strength that matched any man on the field. Centuries later, in 1868, Nakano Takeko led an all-female unit called the Joshitai, the Women's Army, against imperial forces during the Boshin War. She charged the enemy lines with a naginata, was shot in the chest, and asked her sister to cut off her head so the enemy wouldn't take it as a trophy. Even in suicide, samurai women had a ritual called jigai. They would cut their own jugular vein with a short blade. But before doing so, they would bind their legs together with a sash to ensure they fell in a dignified posture. Their concern for propriety extended to their final breath. They were worried about their honor after death. Chivalry turned women into prizes. Bushido turned them into soldiers. Neither is feminism, but only one is functional. Treating 50% of your population as helpless damsels, while the other side is arming theirs with polearms and expecting them to die with the same dignity as the men, is a strategic failure. Knights take this round for the dumber code. The samurai at least gave their women spears. Round 5, the afterlife of a code. Whose legacy killed more people? Chivalry faded. The word survived, but the code behind it dissolved. No nation formed a chivalry revivalist movement. No government weaponized courtly love. The last serious jousting death was King Henry II of France,
who took a lance splinter through his eye in 1559. After that, the tournament tradition quietly died. Today, chivalry means holding a door open. The entire system of feudal theology, battlefield honor, and elaborate obligation has been reduced to a dating tip. It became a punchline, and punchlines do not start wars. Bushido had a very different afterlife. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Japanese imperial government revived and militarized Bushido as a tool of state propaganda. The idea that a warrior should die rather than surrender was taken out of medieval context and applied to modern conscript soldiers, men who had never held a katana in their lives. During World War II, this ideology contributed directly to the kamikaze program, where young pilots strapped themselves into bomb-laden aircraft and flew directly into Allied warships in the Pacific. It drove the refusal to surrender at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where Japanese soldiers fought to the last man in tunnels and caves. And it shaped the mistreatment of prisoners of war, who were viewed with contempt for having allowed themselves to be captured alive. And here is the darkest irony. The book most Westerners associate with the samurai code, Bushido, The Soul of Japan, by Nitobe Inazo, was published in 1899, in English, for a Western audience. Nitobe was a Christian convert educated in the United States who had never been a samurai. The code that supposedly defined an ancient warrior class was largely packaged for export by a man who had more in common with a university professor than a swordsman. A code that was already fiction in its own era was resurrected centuries later and used to send teenagers into aircraft carriers at 300 miles per hour. Chivalry became a punchline. Bushido became a weapon. Only one code killed people centuries after the warriors who supposedly followed it were already dust. Samurai take this round. The verdict. The score is 4-1. The samurai had the code that did more damage. The knight was a mercenary in a fancy suit. He loved money, he adapted to new weapons, and when the world changed, he bought a gun. Chivalry died because it naturally evolved into professional armies in modern warfare. The code was a costume, and the knight eventually took it off. The samurai was a monk with a sword and a death wish. When the world changed, the samurai tried to cut the bullet. Bushido created a warrior class that couldn't afford to eat, refused to use modern weapons, and fetishized death over survival. But the real tragedy is this. The code that supposedly defined the samurai was written after they stopped fighting, popularized by a man who never held a sword, and then handed to a government that used it to justify sending young men to die in burning airplanes. Chivalry was a lie that knights told about themselves. Bushido was a lie that other people told about the samurai. And the samurai never got to correct the record. That is the dumbest honor system of all. One where the honored never had a say. If you enjoyed this breakdown of historical dedication, subscribe before your boss asks you for unyielding loyalty.